Hey everybody, I'm DJ Sixsmith. You're watching The Sit Down, hanging out with Cara, first-time author, The Dearly Beloved, coming out next week. Nice to meet you.
You too.
This was quite a journey for you. And officially 13 years, we'll say, but 15 years to get it to publish.
Yes.
So now that it's coming out next week, what is it like to actually think about putting this whole thing together?
It's really overwhelming. It's been getting a lot of nice things said about it. A lot of nice things are being said, which is a little bit strange to hear, because for so long it was just me in a room with my computer and blank pages and lots of cookies. Eat a lot of cookies.
Yeah, what's your go-to cookie?
Digestive biscuits.
There you go.
Yeah, with the chocolate on top.
So that's your fuel right there.
Yes, that and tea and coffee. Lots of
yes, definitely need those stimulants.
Yeah, so I actually wrote most of it in coffee shops around New York. So I got in that habit.
That's cool.
Yeah, so I would just say it's overwhelming. It doesn't quite feel real yet. Like people keep telling me it will feel real.
Yeah, I'm sure.
When I actually go see it in a bookstore, people
that's when
say,
it gets real.
Yes.
When you're signing it for people you see in the bookstore, that's when it's like, okay, it's actually a thing.
Yes, exactly.
That's
hopefully.
Awesome. Yeah, no, it definitely.
I mean, hopefully that's what it will feel like. And
I'm sure it will. Well, I love the book. I told you off camera. I read the whole thing, just finished it. I want to know how this all started, because I know your parents went to this church, and I know there's that, but where did this all come about?
So I start writing always with characters, so the characters really came to me first. Okay. And they came pretty fully formed. And so we have four main characters. Charles and Lily are married, and James and Nan are Lily. They're not Lily, they're married. And I knew both men were ministers from the beginning. So that is what informed where I set the book. But it was not a hard setting for me, because I grew up in church. I grew up in all sorts of different churches. So the path to get me to writing about church started about 2 generations ago with my grandmother, who's still alive. She's 102.
Wow,
yes.
That's incredible.
And she lived in a very small town in Oklahoma. Her husband was a roughneck on an oil rig, so he was gone for a long time. She had 5 kids, I think under the age of 27. I mean, under the age of 7 by the time she was 27. Wow. And she was hanging out the wash on the line one day, and she saw an angel across her washing line. And from that moment on, the whole family went to church, and they went to a Nazarene church, which was, it's not as strict as footloosey religion, but that's kind of the shorthand.
Gotcha.
You couldn't drink, dance, smoke, listen to music outside of church, that kind of thing. My mother, so my dad grew up in that religion, and my mother grew up in the same religion, but in a very small town in California. Okay. And they met at a church picnic. Oh, wow. Yes, and they hopped in a VW Bug in August with a heater that wouldn't shut off.
Oh my gosh.
They drove across the U.S. And they came to New York City, came to Greenwich Village, so my dad could get an advanced degree at NYU Law. Wow. And my mom got a job at the First Presbyterian Church as the receptionist. So First Presbyterian in New York City on 12th Street and 5th Avenue. So were you thinking of your mom with the receptionist character? No. Oh, God, no. No, I'm sort of thinking, but that whole time period, they arrived in 1965. Right. A lot going on in the 60s, especially in New York. In the city, and so some old pictures of them, and just that feel of what they've told me coming to New York was like, being from smaller towns, and how it really opened their eyes. And they've never left Greenwich Village. Wow. They've lived in Greenwich Village since 1965. We took a couple years in London, but other than that, they never moved to the suburbs. Even in 1970s New York, they just were like, why? We moved here. I mean, everything's going on there. Yeah. Yes. Especially if you're going to drive cross country, it's like, all right, we're staying here. Here. Took a lot to get here. But I grew up going to First Presbyterian. Okay. So the book and the setting is based on First Presbyterian. It's called Third Presbyterian in the book. But I grew up there, and it was a very liberal church for the time. It was a church in New York City. But it was a very community-based church. And we did have 2 pastors when I was growing up, so that plays into this story, yeah. So that made all of that setting easy. They were not difficult characters to place in, a real time and place. So you had those 2 men, but then how do the women come into the picture? So the women, they came to me fully formed. Lily was not the hardest to write, probably the one I feel the most affinity for, but not the hardest to write. I mean, the hardest to write. Nan was the easiest to write, but I have a little less of an affinity for her. And I first just explored their relationships. So one of the things I was really interested in writing a book was to explore the after the happily ever after. So I knew I wanted to tell their courtships. I didn't know if that would end up being part of the book, but I knew it would be part of the backstory. And then how do you sustain that for decades?
Right, for your whole lifetime, yeah.
And I'm fascinated by the way that we all get to know each other. So how we make friends, who ends up becoming our friends, can really, some of it is just a coincidence of timing and place. Some of it you feel kinship right away. Some of it you don't really realize you're friends with that person until you've gone to a million meetings or dinners or a bunch of lunches, and you're like, oh, yeah, you're totally my friend now.
This is a match. This makes sense, right?
So I was really interested in all that. So I was thrilled to have 4 characters to explore that with.
And the backstory is really important because, especially for Charles and Lily, like they are clearly on 2 opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to faith, but yet they put that aside and they decide to do this thing.
Yeah.
And it's funny because we say that, you know, people should be like-minded and then there's the opposites attract thing. Like those are 2 people that believe 2 wildly different things about God, and yet they find a way. So what was it like developing that storyline?
Well, I don't see them as so different. So first of all, Charles from the very beginning knows he's going to be the only person he knows who's a man of faith.
Right.
I mean, his family is not from a church. His father is very anti-religion. So he goes into it with a very solitary path in mind, I think. And they're both intellectual, and they're both really students, and they could both easily be college professors. So I think they're very like-minded in that way. And this is just the biggest issue in their marriage.
Right. Yeah, and it can be for a lot of different people.
Yes.
Even if you are 2 people of faith, you can believe different things, and whether it's different sects of Christianity or whatever you have, that's a really complicated thing. Politics, religion, it's tough to be on the same page with that.
I think it really depends on what religion you're in, because some religions, especially some Christian religions or branches of the Christian religion, believe that you have to go out and save other people's souls to get into heaven. I knew I couldn't really set it in that kind of book. I couldn't write that kind of book. So Presbyterianism is not like that at all. It's very democratic, it's very practical, it's very being in the world. And I think Charles manages to just have his job, and it's his job and his personal faith, and Lily has her own. But I do think that's where a lot of the loneliness in their marriage comes from.
Right, because they're both doing their own thing.
Yes.
And it's strange because you think about the person you're going to spend your life with, you want them in every part of your life, but then there's parts of Lily that Charles doesn't know, Lily doesn't know what Charles is doing at work. Like there's a clear break in that relationship for a long time. So I'm sure there's a lot of couples that can relate to that too, and I'm sure it'll be interesting to see how people react to that.
Yeah, so the interesting reaction I get when people call me up and say, I read your book, I can't believe you wrote it. I'm like, well, thank you. But they end up being Team Nan or Team Lily. So people have a real affinity for one or the other.
And that kind of says something about who they are as a person, right?
Well, you would think, but I can never predict who it's going to be.
Interesting.
Yes.
Well, because they're 2 very distinct women, right?
Yeah.
And just the way they go about their lives. So you'd think it would say something, but I mean, maybe somebody's a little bit more like Lily, but they can understand what Nan's going through.
So, I mean, I've just had 2 really committed atheists come up and tell me they're really Team Nan.
Interesting. And why is that?
I don't know. So one of them is really, and this is a man, so it's not even a woman who's saying this, really longing to get married and have kids. And I think really that longing of Nan's to be married, to have a family, to be a wife and mother he really felt a connection to that. More than Lily, who really said that's not for me at all. It was just more of a work person.
Yeah, there's a lot going on with Nan, you know, even just her dynamic with Lily, but also her walk, because all she wants is to have the family and kids, work at the church, and it takes such a long time. And thankfully it does happen for her, but you just wonder what would happen if it didn't hit for her, you know?
Yeah, her life would have been way harder.
Absolutely.
It would have been, I think, a very sad, devoting herself to God in a very one-dimensional way. And it would have been, I couldn't write her that way. It would have been so mean.
Well, I wonder also when I'm reading the book and I see these four together, like I think about James and Lily and how they could have been paired together, and how Charles and Nan, was that something that a lot of people were thinking?
No, I tried really hard not to go there.
I gotcha.
I think that was not of that time period.
Right.
You know, I think if I'd said it in present day, that would really have had to be explored.
Absolutely. And not even exploring it, but just thinking like on the surface, like these two people, James is kind of more aligned with Lily. Not even that they would pursue a relationship, but like that was fascinating also because here they are in two separate marriages, two guys working together, and two wives that kind of fit better with the other person in a way, right?
In a way, and I do think that's a big part of why Lily is able to come to accept Charles's faith a little bit more, because she sees a more multifaceted view of the way people can have a life of faith and live a life of faith.
Right.
So James is on her end of the spectrum of not believing in God, really, but believing in the good that the church can do in the world if it tries.
Well, another thing I found really fascinating when you mentioned that point is that a man of faith pushing the boundaries of what the church can do, right? So here's James, and he wants to do more. He really wants to save people. He wants to bring all the different types of people in, but people in the church don't like that. So what was it like playing with that? Because that's a real thing. Like that happens in my church. That happens in churches all over the place.
All the time.
Yeah.
That's the whole history of the church.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that was really fun. I don't think you can set a book in 1963 to 1970 and not deal with the social upheavals that are going on in society. And I think that part of the book, his purpose and his life path really brings a lot of life to the book, because he's always like, we have to do more, we have to do more, we have to do more. So he was really fun to write.
I'm sure he was.
Sort of running around with his hair on fire all the time.
It's like, hey, James, maybe you need a little break, collect yourself.
In fact, at some point I was like, I can't make him a redhead because that would just be too on the nose. So, but he was really fun to write because I think he keeps the book from being as quiet as it could be, or not as religious as it could be, but sort of as sermon-y as it might have fallen into. He really breaks in there and is like, let's stop all that. Like, come on, we got to get out in the world. We have to help as many people as we can. We have to change these social constructs. Yeah.
And there's plenty going on with faith, and in part two, people are going to see a lot going on with family.
Yes.
And we won't get into specifics, but the challenges that come with family.
Yes.
And for Charles and Lily, they have kids, and there are things that come up that they don't anticipate. So when you were diving into that, what were you thinking about, and what was it like fleshing that all out, just in terms of parents who are thrust into this position and now don't know what to do with their kids?
I think that's really easy to think about when you are a parent, though my child is perfect.
You're not just saying that because she's behind the camera, too.
But I always knew that would happen, like none of this, so that storyline is actually one of the 3 factual things I took from my childhood church. So I knew it was there. What wasn't a surprise to me. Sometimes characters are like, haha, we're surprising you. Now write this.
No, this actually happened.
This actually happened. So I just think we all have challenges in life where we just look at them and they just seem like a brick wall. And you're just like, I can't do any, what can I do with this? And you can't walk away from that wall when you have a kid, right? So they're given the chance to walk away from that, but I just don't think someone like Lily, who lost her parents, is ever going to then abandon a child. That part was really hard for me. Charles and Lily's first reactions were very clear to me, but didn't make sense to me. So I really had to write them deeply and spend a lot of time with each of them, because their reactions surprised me, especially Charles's. But I think any sort of going deeper into a relationship and challenging yourself and challenging what you think and what you expected, if you stick with it, only deepens your personal experience.
Yeah.
So whether you stick with what you're doing or at some point you say it's just not going to work, you come out of it much deeper. And that's what I was really working on. I spent a lot of time on that whole the beginning of part 2 because I was like, I really got to get this right because I know where they end up. Right?
Yeah.
So
but a matter of but showing that is a difficult thing because you have to go through the different layers. And it's like Lily becoming a mother, Charles dealing with what just happened to his son, and then going through all that. And then also, interestingly enough, the other people who come into their lives. And this really scary thing that some people who are not parents may know your kids better than you do. And that was something where it's just like, it hits you like right in the gut, like, wow. You know, somebody else comes in and they're able to connect with your son in a way that you as a father can't. Like that's a lot to deal with. So how did you jump into that whole point?
I kind of take that for granted.
I bet.
So in the acknowledgements of this book, I actually acknowledge the 3 people who basically parented my child as I would parent her. You form these very strong bonds with the people who say to you, I'm gonna show up and we're gonna raise these kids. I'm gonna share the load with you, not in a familial way, but like, oh my God, I'm running 20 minutes late for pickup from school. Will you
Can you help me out here? Yeah,
that kind of thing.
You need those people.
So it took me so long to write that when I was revising all of that, I had a really strong sense of what those relationships were like. It's harder for these characters because they're not people they necessarily like, who show up and say, okay, I'm helping you.
Yeah, but you have to just accept that. You need those people.
I mean, I love the characters that come in the second part of the book. They were total surprises. I've gotten really good feedback from some people like, I knew someone just like that who helped me and my kids. And so I don't feel that that's a bad thing when someone comes in and helps.
I don't think so either.
Says to you, you're not considering this about your child.
No,
I'm like, oh, thank God.
Yeah, because
tell me more.
Because as a parent, you reach a certain limit, and sometimes you just can't get past that, and you need somebody else to help you out, and that's okay too.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
It's funny though that you say that certain characters surprised you, and also that you knew that these characters were going to be a certain way. Like I don't know if I've heard an author talk like that before.
Well, my process is so much character driven. I mean, they really present themselves to me fully formed. So I'm working on a second book, and those characters are fully formed. That doesn't mean I know them well.
Okay.
They just have a life, and so I feel like my process as a writer is to write down this world that is given to me, and I'm supposed to write it down. And it sort of comes fully formed, and I explore it, and I learn different things about the characters, and I write those down. I don't like to move my characters around. I don't like to make terrible things happen to them. I sort of, their story comes to me pretty fully formed too. So I just kind of wait for that to show up.
I gotcha.
And so the secretary, Jane Alice, fully formed. There was a woman at my church who had a voice like that. She was like this tall, and she was like, hello, and she would read the scripture, and you were like,
whoa. We're like, wow.
So that voice came to me, that context of the voice in a very small body, the big voice. But a lot of those characters came to me, and I was like, ooh, I got a gift.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So you had this big runway to explore faith, people, the church. What are some things you learned along the way, or some things that just surprised you about your own faith?
Well, my faith is never really, I'm actually pretty spiritual. I think the vocabulary for talking about faith is limited.
Yeah.
And I was never constrained by one dogma, so I went to a lot of different churches growing up. So I went to church in Oklahoma, I went to church in California, which is
so you saw all different types of
I went to a church school,
Yeah.
I went to, which was Episcopal, I went to First Presbyterian. So I never had a concept that there was one way to practice faith. And that was very helpful going into this, to just, I could be as open-minded as I wanted. I think that I have realized how little we talk about faith most of our friendships are secular. So I've been going to church regularly because my daughter's a professional chorister. She was. So I would go to church every other week when she sang. And sometime in there I was like, realized I had never had a conversation with any one of my church friends about whether they believed in God.
Really?
Never had a personal conversation about our faith.
Wow.
And that still blows my mind. I'm still wrestling with that because I still think that that's a really odd question to ask someone. Like to sit across the table and say, do you believe in God? So
no, listen, I totally understand. And I would say for me, and I go to a Christian chapel, I'm very comfortable with my Christian friends and having that conversation.
Yes, okay.
But then whether it's people here in the office or people in everyday life, having the conversation, do you believe in God? Yeah. That seems like a major leap.
Yes.
So yeah, it doesn't matter if you're in that circle or you're not in that circle. It's just something that is an uncomfortable thing to talk about at times.
And it's so weird. So I've had people come to me. I've had more conversations about faith now that the book is out.
Sure you have.
It's still not with my friends so much, but I get to hear everybody's origin faith story. So I've been doing some booksellers dinners, and that they all go, "Are you religious?" And I'm like, I don't know how to explain my religion to you, but yes.
Well, that's such an easy label that people like to slap, and like you're saying with spirituality, there's so much more that goes beyond religion, and some people just don't understand that.
Yes.
And some people just don't understand what a relationship with God looks like because there's many different ways that it looks like. So yeah, you kind of unpack a little bit of all this, and another part of it that I really liked is that exposing brokenness in your faith, and that you can have doubt in your faith. You could be a person of faith and you go through these peaks and valleys. And that's another thing that people don't understand. So what was it like telling that part of the story?
I love telling that part
Yeah, I'm sure you did, where Charles is like, listen, like, this is what's been going on for me, and laying it all out. And some people don't like that, but I personally thought, like, that's awesome.
Yeah. Well, in my 20s, I went to a church that the minister always preached to the devout believers, the people who were questioning, and the people who didn't believe at all, and just were kind of church for the community. So his sermons were always three-pronged,
I gotcha.
Which I found fascinating.
Yeah.
So that obviously stayed with me. I think I loved writing about the brokenness in faith. I just don't think people talk about it enough, and I think you have a relationship with God like you have a relationship with any other person. So it's like somebody described this book to me where God is the fifth character.
Oh, absolutely.
And so they all have their own relationships with God.
Right. Yeah, and those relationships goes through different trials and tribulations.
Yes.
You know, you could be having a great time with God, or times where you feel really distant.
Yeah.
You know, and that's just real.
Yeah. And even atheists have a relationship with God.
Yeah.
So.
Right. It's just it could be a very one-sided conversation.
They just don't believe. You're not part of my life.
But the thing is, like we were talking off camera, like this is not just a book about religion.
No.
Like there's so much more, and I think that's really important for you to say, because like even like there's a CBS show called God Friended Me, and at first you're just thinking it's just about religion, and no, it's about people, and faith is just the umbrella in which they're able to figure things out. So how difficult has it been kind of getting people past that point?
I think everyone who reads this book and almost everyone who's reviewed it so far says this is not a book about religion. This is not a religious book. That nobody gets in a pulpit and tells anyone how they're supposed to act. And I think because they're four separate characters with very different ideas of faith, and neither of the ministers come from a tradition of faith, so their paths to ministry have been a personal choice, not an inherited one.
Right.
Made that much easier. That was just my favorite part. But I don't know. It's hard to say because I'm not allowed to say
I know there's stuff you can't
say.
Yeah. Well, coming to a close here, there's something really beautiful about the way that you finish it with the dearly beloved. And what that represents, because in culture we think about the dearly beloved and how that is woven into weddings, but in this book it represents those core people who have been there for the family, like you talked about. So what was it like coming to that point, and what should this represent when people check it out?
Well, first of all, the dearly beloved was not the original title. That's what my editor came up with, and it took me like 2 weeks to be like, and then I was like, oh, I get it.
What was the original title?
Everything There Is to Know, which I'm a terrible. I didn't have a title for a long time. I put a title on it when I was sending it out.
It's tough to put a title on something like this. Yeah.
But it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
The book originally ended with a wedding. It now ends with a christening.
Yeah.
I really needed them to be in church at the end. I thought that was really important. And I needed to find a way to get Lily, especially into church, without it being a service. I always knew where it would end, with them all together. I think this idea of dearly beloved is something really important to me. I think it's, I tend to be standoffish and shy and a little bit closed, and I'm trying to open myself up more and more. I'm succeeding more and more in just saying, everybody's the dearly beloved.
Right. This is me.
Yes.
And just be transparent and lay it out there.
And I'm going to come to you in a spirit of like, I want to know the best things about you. So let's figure those out. Let's come that way.
Especially in the world that we live in today, coming from a place of love, you can disagree with somebody, but just having that be at the forefront, I think is the most important thing.
But it's so hard.
Yeah, totally.
And what I love about the way that the ending came to me is that we see these main characters go through their first real life crises. And then in the end, they send the younger generation out with hope and knowing, you know, that it is not going to be easy for these characters that they're sending off into the world, and still with a lot of optimism and with a lot of like, it's going to be great. Like, not over the top optimism and, you know, not foolhardy optimism, but just like, you're going to get the good with the bad.
Yeah.
And I really like that. I mean, that every time I read the end, I'm like, oh, yeah, okay, so we are sending these people off with hope. We're not ending on a sense of dissolution, like the bonds hold. So I heard when I was talking to ministers about this book, this one woman said to me, she's a minister, and she said, the most interesting sermon I ever heard about was some friends of hers went to church, and this minister had gone through a terrible family ordeal. And he got up to preach when he came back, and he said, friends, I have been to the bottom, and the bottom holds. And that was his entire sermon.
Wow.
And that's how I feel. I feel like, okay, the bonds hold in the end. That's not spoiling anything. You kind of know that from the beginning.
I think that's perfectly said.
But I just like the concept that the bonds will hold you. If you create the bonds will hold you, even if you are trying to get, you know, away. That sounds very dire. But even when you feel too weak to make new bonds, the bonds you have made will hold you.
Beautifully said. And this book will grip you. The Dearly Beloved, out next week. Cara, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really nice to meet you.
You too.
That's Cara. I'm DJ. We'll see you next time here on The Sit Down.